Well, Claire didn't want to ask you. This is going to get confusing with all the Claires, isn't it? Claire didn't want to ask Dr. Claire, but I do. What is a sex geek?
So first of all, thank you so much, Claire and Liz, for having me here. One of my favourite things to do is to talk about sex with women, so it's an absolute pleasure to be here. In terms of what being a sex science geek is, what it means is that I can't help but bring my other roles, my kind of medicine science roles, into this area of sexuality, which is, and think about, well, what do we actually know? What research evidence do we have? What kind of research is out there about science, about sex and science, so that we can start to fill in some of the gaps about what we might intuitively think, intuitively know, with what we actually know from science. So for me, that's what a sex science geek is. Somebody who likes to delve in and about it, but also to try to bring some of the more sort of scientific aspects to it as well. So that's how I would define what a sex science geek is.
Does it have much, like, does it have much to do with your day job as well? Like, how much do you discuss sex with your oncology patients?
So it's interesting you should say that, because when I first started to become interested in sexology and sex science, it seemed quite separate in some ways. It was something I did in my own time, and it was about based on my own experience and what I wanted to explore. And then working with patients with breast cancer, of course, a significant proportion of them will be rendered menopausal by the treatment that we give them. And that's where my initial interest in menopause came before I started having my own experience. And as part of that, one, it was difficult for women to discuss just the menopausal side effects of the treatment that we're experiencing. But if it was difficult to do that, it was almost impossible to discuss the sexual aspects. And then it all sort of came together in this unholy matrimony, I call it, of, oh, actually, this stuff that I do over here and these things that I do over here come together quite beautifully. So yes, in answer to your question, I ask almost all of my patients when I see them in relation to their breast cancer journey, not necessarily right at the beginning of their journey when they're dealing with chemo and all the rest of it, but as they start to get through and we're dealing with hormonal manipulation and a kind of chemically induced menopause for many women, then absolutely I ask pretty much all of my patients. And of course, the word gets round and then they want to see you because they know that you'll talk about it. And that's when it really became apparent to me that this was an issue, that there was nowhere for women to go. And if it true for these women in this particular circumstance, it actually was probably likely true for most women. So yeah, absolutely, it has kind of all come together in as I call it, the unholy matrimony.
And the women are really keen to discuss it, because we always think, you know, like women our generation have this thing of women don't like sex. You know, yeah. we put up with it. Or if you do, then you're a slut or a slag or something like that. But, you know, women are quite keen to discuss things with you.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that was really... And again, you've got to gauge that. It's not for me to make people talk about things they don't want to talk about in any circumstance, be it, you know, in the day-to-day medical work or in the other work that I do specifically with people experiencing the menopause and having sexual difficulties in terms of the sex coaching. But for, you know, people want to talk about it. And what we need to do is we need to make spaces for that to happen, because if nobody talks about it, how do you know? And often for the people that I deal with, there's an awful lot of shame and guilt and old scripts and old habits and old things that come up from how they were conditioned and the messages that they got as young people. It means they get to midlife and they're really lost because they were already having some difficulties and issues around what does it mean to be a sexual being? I don't even really know what that means. And then, of course, you just land the menopause and midlife and all of the other stresses that come on with that. So my experience is that if you create the spaces, then people will come, and they really do have an awful lot of benefit even just from being able to talk about it.
I think a lot of women are hesitant as well, because unless you're seeing sex as a purely functional thing, which is, you know, having children, so you go see your GP if you've got any problems, going to see it purely because you don't have the pleasure in your life seems a bit frivolous. And women are so reluctant to go see the GP for menopause symptoms anyway, because I remember when mine, it was hot flushes. I was like, it's just hot flushes. Why do I need to see a GP for hot flushes? So I can imagine for sex, that's even worse.
And I think that is one of the areas where I think we really need to start the conversation. So a significant proportion of women will come to me and say, or go to their GP and say, I'm having pain, I need to not have pain. And the marker of having a successful sex life is it not being painful. And that's a really saddening experience, that's what we're aspiring to take part in something that at least isn't painful. And where I'm trying to go with it is to try to change the narrative and say, you know, pleasure is our birthright. We are wired, we are made for pleasure, but we have to allow ourselves, and we have to have the opportunity to learn how to do that, because for many of us, we've never had that opportunity. And, you know, it is, as you described, something that's functional, something we've got to get over. It's something that we do for our partner. It's not really about us. And a lot of what I'm doing is about trying to bring people back to say, you know, actually your pleasure is available to you. It is there for you, but you, if you don't know how to do that, then there are ways that you can be supported to live your full sexual life. Because our sexual, a sort of phrase that I use often is, you know, we are made from sex and stardust. And we come from sex. It is our sexual energy, is our life force energy. It's the things that bring creativity in the world. You can harness your sexual energy to get stuff done in the world and be who you want to be and show up and all of those kind of things. But often there is a big disconnect for the people that I work with around understanding that actually their sexuality is a really juicy and important and fun and engaging and enriching part of their lives.
There's also, I suffer from restless leg syndrome, and if anybody gets it and gets its part of your menopause, orgasms are really good for helping to stop it. So orgasms have, you know, positive impacts on your body as well in menopause.
Absolutely. You know, so we know a lot about the benefits of orgasm in terms of the hormonal milieu, so that the kind of hormonal mix that is released at orgasm. It's relaxing, it helps people to sleep better, it improves our mood, and it also improves our pelvic floor tone. There's all sorts of things that orgasm is good for. But of course, some of the things that people come to me with when they get to this point in life is that their orgasms have disappeared, or they're not as strong, or it takes longer to get to orgasm, and they start to panic and they think that they're broken. And because nobody talks about it, the stress becomes worse, and you get into this loop of dreading it, experiencing it, not getting anywhere, dreading it, experiencing it, not getting anywhere. And then all of a sudden, the vast majority of women, by the time they will seek some help from someone, will not have had any kind of sexual interaction. And we can deal with the fact that sex isn't penetration when we come to it, but have not had any sort of interaction for up to 2 years before they will seek help, by which point they're in a state, their relationships are in a state, and it just and on and on and on.
So what are the main challenges when you hit perimenopause or menopause itself? What are the main challenges to women with sex? And we are talking at the minute like heterosex, but obviously, you know, for lesbians as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really important point to bring in terms of trying to make this an inclusive discussion, is that it's not just women who experience menopause. So trans men, for example, would experience menopause. We have this idea of menopause being a middle-aged issue, but younger women who are being medically treated, or maybe surgical menopause for some reason, and also people who may be non-binary, who don't identify either as male or female, and intersex people who may have a, you know, gender and sex and sexuality as a spectrum. So absolutely, I think it's really important to bring that up, that, you know, often in these spaces we are, because of the age of the women that we're talking about, you know, cis heterosexual relationships. But, you know, if we're just aware that we try to keep our spaces inclusive for anyone who might be experiencing the menopause, which is why I try to use the word people rather than women and all those kind of things. But yeah, I think that's really important to be aware of. So when people start to experience the menopause, often the very first symptom before people will even twig is vaginal dryness. And that was my own experience. And I didn't, again, and I know, and I didn't twig it, I didn't put the dots together. So very often before people notice anything around hot flushes or mood sweats, night sweats or mood changes, they'll kind of go, oh, it's not quite as juicy as it was before, and they might notice they're needing to lubrication. And so vaginal dryness and vulval pain and what's called the genitourinary syndrome of menopause, which we can break down in a little minute, is one of the key reasons why people start to begin to have difficulties with their sex life. So that's one, so we can come back to that. The second one is around this idea about loss of libido. So that is often the first thing that people will come and they'll say, I've lost my libido. And we can talk about that because it's nonsense, but we can come back to that too. And then the third thing, which goes along with this genitourinary syndrome of menopause, is loss of sensation, loss of ability to orgasm, things just don't feel quite the same down there anymore. And I think, so they're the three main things. And I think one of the things that can be really helpful for people to understand is it is really happening. You're not imagining it. So it is real, because in my experience, what happens is people go, they start to worry, and then they go, is this happening because I'm worrying? And there's nobody to talk to about it. So it is real. I think that's a really important thing for people to understand. It is really happening to you. So stop worrying about whether you're making it up, is the first thing. So maybe if we come back and break some of those down in terms of the experience. So why don't we talk about loss of libido first, because that's the one I probably see the most often.
And you said it's nonsense.
It's nonsense. Yeah. No, what I'm going to say is not that people's experience is nonsense. People's experience is what they're having. But the idea that we have a sex drive or that we have spontaneous libido is in general nonsense. That's what we've been told, that's what we see from the media, that's what our pervasive culture tells us, that we should be experiencing what I call a bolt of lightning to the fanny. So this idea, that was the wrong time to take a drink.
Don't say that when I'm drinking.
This idea that we should spontaneously, out of the blue, be ready for sex. That somehow doing the washing up, we're going to be overcome with this desire to have sex. And that is what is portrayed to us in our cultural narrative about how we should experience sex. And actually, it's nonsense. We know from the science that the vast majority of women will experience not spontaneous desire, but what's called responsive desire. So what that means is, once things start to hot up, once we start to get going, once we start to allow ourselves, then we will experience desire. And loads of women experience it. They can't, there's almost like a brick wall to getting started. But once they get going, they can kind of warm up and go, actually, and they get to the end, they go, why don't we do this more often? So that idea that we should spontaneously want to have sex out of the blue is nonsense. It is based on a male-centric view of what the sexual response looks like. And for millennia, women have been almost, the idea that women's sexuality and desire and arousal and response is a slightly broken version of the male version of what is portrayed to us. And that's simply not true. So the reason that that's important is because, yes, when we get to the menopause, if you weren't experiencing it before in terms of this spontaneous desire to want to have sex, you're certainly not going to experience it now. But that doesn't mean that your responsive desire mechanism is not working. And often what happens is, and there's this classic phrase that I use all the time, is put your body in the bed. Put your body in the bed and see what happens, because what you will find is, once you get going, once you can get out of your head, once we can deal with some of the other things that we're going to talk about, like dryness and all the rest of it, you will find that you will have some kind of sexual response. But don't expect a bolt to the fanny. It's not going to happen. It didn't happen to you before, and it isn't going to happen to you now.
It's cool. So you touched upon how women feel invisible, like the psychological part. How much do you deal with that? Because women often say, I feel invisible in midlife. I don't feel like I'm me. I don't feel like I know who I am anymore. And that can have a huge impact on your sex life as well, because if you don't love yourself, then you're not going to want to share your body with anybody. So how can we tackle that?
That is also very common, but it also becomes quite self-perpetuating. So I think that, again, we get into these cycles and these habits of thinkings and beliefs that then just perpetuate themselves. And then, of course, you may have the whole body image issue that's come for certain women who describe weight gain, changes in their body that they don't want to experience. And some of where I start with a lot of that is around about acceptance. So often people come looking to go back to something. So they're looking to go back to something that has gone. And often what we need to say is we need to make it peace and acceptance with where we are now. Yes, it's not as it was before, but actually for many people, it will be better going forward. But there is a transition period in the middle where we need to stop grieving. Well, we need to do the grieving for what has gone. But once we've gone through that piece and reached the place of acceptance, then we can start to move forward. So the invisible piece, some of that it also comes down to women in midlife who will have put everybody else's needs first before themselves. So they have been conditioned to make themselves invisible and their needs invisible and their wants invisible. And some of what we're doing is starting to say, well, okay, is it perhaps time that you took some of that back? Is it perhaps time that you started to turn some of that attention inwards and decide, what is it you really want? Because often we don't know what we really want because we've never allowed ourselves to figure it out, what it is that we really want. So there's a fabulous exercise that I do that's called the I want list. So we sit with women and we say, right, write down, what is it? Doesn't matter, don't censor it. What is it that you want? You know, if you want to go and dress up like a chicken and have sex in the garden, write it. It doesn't matter what it is for now, but allow yourself to want. We need to want to want. And once we've got the wants, then we can start to go, okay, well, actually, if I look at that want list, I quite like that one more than that one. So what can I do? But we have to allow ourselves to want first. And that invisibility piece means that women often don't feel confident to do that. They don't feel that they should believe to want. They don't feel that they're worthy of wants. And that's sometimes where we need to start, is really right back at the beginning in terms of, you know, who are you and what do you want? And often there's a lot of unpicking and unpacking to do first before we start to move forward.
Absolutely, because women are taught, you know, you put your wants last. Definitely. So learning how, I think that's what menopause is all about, is learning how to reassess your life for the next stage. And it's much more about what you want.
Yeah,
and
certainly for women who perhaps, say, women who have chosen to have children, or women who have chosen not to have children, or women who are childless not by choice. There's a whole lot of stuff goes with all of that, and there does come a point where, you know, either your children grow up or you make peace with the fact you're going to be childless or whatever it is that you can then move on from. But what I say to people is, you know, if you don't intentionally choose, your life is going to happen to you anyway. So whatever happens, whatever habits come, they come from either choosing actively or allowing it to happen to you. And this is the perfect time, this transition piece of the perfect time to taking some control and saying, okay, well, this is what I want. And if you don't know what you want, that's also okay. You can start to think about how you work out what it is that you want.
And of course, vaginal dryness is, you've mentioned it a few times, but that is the big one that always gets mentioned on Facebook, you know, all the forums and everything. So what advice can you give? Because I mean, you know, women are told lose it or use it or lose it, the other way around. Is that right?
So yes, to a certain degree, that is right. And the reason for that is because I'm going to bring in, look, I never go anywhere without my vulva. This is Verity. This is Verity, the velvet vulva puppet. Okay, and she is. I'm going to use her. Let me get her in field. So the importance of this is that all of these tissues. So if we look here, these are the outer lips here that are usually covered with hair. These are our inner lips, so our clitoral hood, the clitoris under here, our urethra, which is where we pee out of, which is here, and then the vaginal canal itself. So all of these tissues and the tissues behind them, so that's up to the bladder and the pelvic floor, for example, all of these tissues are reliant on estrogen. And when the estrogen starts to drop, then all of these tissues, so that includes, you know, the vaginal dryness that we've experienced, but you can get loss of the actual tissue here. You can get loss of clitoral tissue. You can get loss of the tissue internally of the clitoris, which is the part that swells and expands when we become aroused. So all of that system requires estrogen to work, but it also requires to be used to keep it in good condition. So the use it or lose it piece, yes, absolutely is important, because if we're not exercising that tissue and not exercising those muscles, then yes, they begin to do that awful word, which is atrophy, which basically means that the tissues start to die away. So it is a use it or lose it system, but how do you use it if you've got dryness? How do you use it if you've got pain? So there are a number of different ways to deal with that. The first is to moisturize your fanny the way you would moisturize your face. So when we get to a certain age, we should be thinking about moisturizing not just this bit up here. So that might be by using specific products that are designed for vaginal moisturization, and there are specific products that are particularly good for the menopause, because there is also a change in the acidity in our vagina, and there's also a change in the types of good bacteria that grow in our vagina as we start to go through the menopause. So you can use lubricants that can help with pH, and you can use moisturizers that can help to kind of restore and moisturize the delicate vulval and vaginal tissues. So that can either be a specialized moisturizer, so there are long-acting moisturizers that you can get on prescription from your GP. You can also buy them over the counter, but you can also moisturize any edible oil. You can moisturize your vulva with. And I find that this is often a really helpful way for women to begin to connect with their genitals. So an awful lot of women have never looked at their genitals. They haven't touched their genitals in a meaningful way. So we start to create a relationship with our genitals that they're actually part of our body and not some black hole, which is what a lot of women have in terms of their map in their head, that this bit of them doesn't even really exist and they don't know what it looks like. And, you know, if I say to you, imagine your left hand, you can imagine your left hand. If I say, imagine your left inner labia, we've got no mental map. So to start to get women in touch with and in control with their genitalia. So moisturizing is really good for that on all sorts of levels. So it's just on the physical moisture level, but also in terms of getting us in touch with our lady bits and starting to honor them and provide love and support and care. So moisturizing is one. The next one is obviously to use local hormones, so local hormones that we use in the vagina. So some women will elect to have HRT and some women will not. That's entirely up to individual choice about what they want to do. If you elect not to have HRT, but you do have issues with vulval pain, vaginal dryness, incontinence, which is also a part of this syndrome, then you can use estrogens locally within the vagina. And the good thing about that is that they only really act locally. They don't become absorbed into the rest of your body in any meaningful way, which means that the risks that are perhaps associated with HRT that women are worried about around breast cancer, around blood clotting, those sort of things, those risks don't exist with local topical estrogen. And it's extremely effective. And even for women who may be using full HRT systemically, so either they're taking tablets or patches, about 1 in 4 of those women will still have vaginal problems as well, and you can use them both together. So vaginal hormones and things are really extremely useful, and it changes it. Just that on its own can change people's lives, because if you are painful that you can't sit down, you can't wipe when you go to the toilet, you're having issues with incontinence because that's all part and parcel of the same process, then vaginal estrogens can be really, really helpful.
It's so true. I had never understood how much vaginal dryness affected people until a couple of women in my menopause group told me about it. And yeah, they couldn't even sit down some days. It was horrendous for them. And one of them had just started a new relationship. And luckily she had a really understanding partner who took things nice and slow and steady. So what advice would you give to women in that situation who have vaginal dryness and are getting into a new sexual relationship?
Okay. So one of the first things that I would say around vaginal dryness and this whole area that we're talking about, this whole genitourinary syndrome of menopause, is that unlike some of the other menopausal symptoms that will get better with time, so for example, the hot flushes and things, we'll come out of the other side of those and things will settle. The genitourinary syndrome of menopause tends not to get better because it is because of the loss of estrogen. It will not get better with time. So my advice to women generally is, if you're having problems, intervene early. So decide what you're going to do, get some advice, think about your options and do something early, because as you start to lose some of the tissue and the tissue becomes much more delicate and much more friable and much more likely to split and be sore, it's harder and harder the further down that road you get to come back again. So the first thing would be, to any person who's experiencing that, is to think about it early and don't wait. It is likely not going to get better on its own. So that's the first thing. So the second thing about starting a new relationship, so the core of any partnered sexual relationship is always communication. So it's always about, how do we communicate with each other what our needs are, what our wants are, where our boundaries are, what we would like to experience, what we're prepared to do for the other. So communication is really key. But of course, a lot of women feel very embarrassed to discuss the symptoms that they're having. So my advice would be, get over your embarrassment, because it's going to be difficult if you can't communicate. It's going to be really difficult if you can't communicate. So pluck up the courage, take a deep breath, explain. Now, the vast majority of women will have at some point in their lives experienced penetration that they're not ready for. And so we need to understand that our arousal mechanism and our systems take much longer to get to the same state as it will do for your average man, for example. So we need to be talking about slowing down. We need to be talking about taking our time, and we also need to be talking about, what does sex actually mean to us? I mean, sex is a whole spectrum of things. There is not a penis and a vagina. So ask any lesbian; they will tell you it's perfectly possible to have a hugely fulfilling sex life without a penis ever in a vagina. So there is also something about negotiating, what does this mean to us? And to expand our sexual repertoire and our sexual menu to include things that feel good for us that might not even include penetration, for example. So thinking about learning together about what things feel good, what is it we want from a sexual relationship. And again, sometimes doing that I want list. When we ask people to write down what they want from a sexual relationship, it's not, I want to feel a penis and a vagina. It's, I want to have intimacy. I want to have eye contact. I want to have softness. I want to have closeness. And then it's about figuring out, if you do that with your partner, what things match up and how do you achieve those things in a way that feels nourishing for both of you. Again, it might be that you do want to have full intercourse, in which case it's thinking about things like, how do I manage vaginal dryness on a longer term, not just in this particular moment. So thinking about, as the things that we've talked about, moisturizers and vaginal estrogens, if that's the road you want to go down. And then the other thing that I tell every woman, doesn't matter what age you are, which is lube, 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 lube. You can never have too much lube. And again, there's a kind of cultural narrative that we should somehow magically be able to summon up exactly the right amount of lubrication that we need. And that's just not the case for all sorts of reasons. So finding a lubricant that really works for you, something that you feel in tune with, something that you can use. Again, you can use them outside of a particular sexual interaction, so that you're beginning to develop a relationship with, what does it feel like to look after my genitals? And again, using particular techniques with lube. So there's this idea called the double glide technique, which has actually been studied. One of the products being Yes, which is one of the brands that people will have known of. And it's the idea that you use an oil-based lube and a water-based lube because they don't mix. So what you do is you lather yourself, both of you, in oil-based lube first, and then put the water-based lube over the top, which adds this double glide idea. So it can be really useful for menopausal fannies to try that approach, in my experience.
So I think it's really important to emphasize that sex doesn't have to be penetration as well. One of the women in our stories video, we got several women to talk about the menopause, and she gets constant UTIs, and she says penetration is just not an option at the moment, but they still have a lovely time.
Yeah, absolutely. And, again, that is about communicating what your needs are and what it is you actually want from this experience. And that comes back to sometimes, many of the women that I see come to get help and support, not for them, actually, for their partner. And we have to unpick all of that and go, okay, well, what is it that you want out of all of this? You are not a vessel to be filled with a penis for someone else's pleasure. Where did that narrative come from? And how do we start to unpick some of that? And how do you take back some of the control for yourself about what it is that you want? And it is perfectly possible to have a meaningful, nourishing, orgasmic filled, if that's what you want, sex life without ever having penetration ever again. And equally, if you don't want any of that and you are quite happy, that is also okay. What I really want to get, or hope that we don't end up in the places that women are now feeling pressurized into having a sex life that they don't want to have. I mean, that's not what this is about either. It's about you choosing what's right for you. And if you are quite content and expressing yourself in a sexual way is not something that's important to you, that's fine too. It's about trying to make choices that feel right for us.
Yeah, my friend is quite happy not having a sex life. She's like, she's just very settled with it. Settled's the wrong word, but she's just happy. She's like, it was never that important to me anyway, so I'm okay, I'm fine. She's good with it, yeah.
And I think that whatever women want to experience is entirely up to them, you know, and I think we need to try and get away from this idea that sex is something that we do for other people, or something that we have to be doing if we don't want to do it. Now, for a great many women who were having shit sex anyway, let's face it, the menopause is an absolute gift because it gives them an opportunity to get out of having that shit sex they didn't want to be having. I would try and, in that kind of situation, there is something there about having lost an aspect of yourself, about having lost an aspect of being in connection with what your own sexuality means for you. Because for many women that I know, they have better sex on their own. So again, getting away from this idea that sex has to be a partnered activity, it absolutely does not have to be a partnered activity. And some of my, you know, I have a daily self-pleasure practice. So I have a, you know, and that's a whole other conversation about women in their 50s about talking about masturbation, God forbid. You know, so I have a regular self-pleasure practice. It's got nothing to do with anyone else. It's about me. It's about being with myself. It's about nourishing. It's about being in touch with my sexual self and this life force energy and what I do with that in the world. You don't even need a partner for any of that.
Just need Chris Hemsworth on the video. That does it for me every time. Quite happy.
Objectification, that's exactly what we want.
More of that, please. Okay, I have to ask, in the literature that was sent out, that Claire sent out, there is a thing called Orgasmic Yoga. Now, my yoga guru doesn't do this on YouTube, I have to say. So what is Orgasmic Yoga?
So I am currently coming to the end of my training as a sexological body worker. And what that means, it's about using, it's about supporting and coaching people to help them understand their own erotic and sexual potential. So it's about learning. It's really about learning. So people will come because they'll have many different difficulties that they might be experiencing, but the approach that we take is about learning. So it's not about coming to be fixed. There's nothing wrong with you. It's about coming to learn about your body. And one of the modalities that we use in that, which was developed by a chap called Joseph Kramer in the States, is called Orgasmic Yoga. And the reason that it's called Orgasmic Yoga is because it is a practice. So it's a practice like yoga where you turn up, put your body in the bed. So it's a bit like get your body on the mat, you put your body in the bed, and it's an exploratory practice. It uses breath, it uses sound, it uses movement, and it's an exploration. Where are we right now? There is nothing to be achieved, there's nothing to be attained, but it's essentially a type of self-pleasure practice that's not focused on getting us somewhere. It's not focused on orgasm. It's about focusing on what we can feel in the moment, being alive with the sensation. So it's akin to yoga in many ways. It's about presence, it's about breathing, it's about sounding, it's about movement, but most importantly, it's about practice. You get up and you do the practice, whether you want to do the practice or not. And then it's about the noticing. What do we notice in our bodies? What is alive for us right now? And simply noticing. So you set an intention at the beginning, same as you would do with yoga. You set an intention about what you want for your practice, you do your practice, and you do an installation at the end. So a bit like you would do Shavasana if you were doing yoga and you lie still at the end, you do something very similar to just notice. What does it notice to be in an aroused state or not in an aroused state? At what level of arousal are we? We tend to, in sexological bodywork, we tend to use a kind of scale of arousal. So I'm at level 1 arousal, I'm at level 5 arousal. So it's about becoming much more aware of our sexual selves and what it feels like to work with our sexuality. So that's what Orgasmic Yoga is.
See, I have real trouble with mindfulness, but I think mindfulness masturbation I could really go for.
So mindful masturbation moves us on from the orgasmic yoga. So that's when we start to do. So the orgasmic yoga can involve touch, particularly anywhere. It doesn't have to necessarily be genital touch, but you might include it. But there is also a practice within sexological bodywork, which is about mindful masturbation. And that's exactly what it is. So it's about what do I, when I do this, what exactly is it that I notice? Do I notice do I notice where I'm being touched, or do I notice the touch of my fingers, which are two completely different things. So it's about becoming really mindful about our movements, really mindful about what we can feel. It's about focusing our attention, because often what will happen, and it happens I would say both in all genders and all sexualities, but for women who've perhaps had sex that they don't want to be having, they what we call dissociate. So they can switch off and they can be doing something else completely differently whilst there's nothing, they're engaged here, but the two things are disconnected from each other. So the mindful masturbation practices and other practices that we do start to bring people back into their body to really focus on the sensation. So absolutely, mindful masturbation is a real thing. So there you go, you can try that tomorrow.
I'll try it. My yoga guru always says, leave your ego at the door. And thinking back, there's a few sexual partners who I think should have been taught that. So yes, we can put yoga through into the bedroom. I could talk to you all night, but I'm very aware we've got lots of people who might have questions. So I'm going to throw it open to anybody. Claire, have we got any other Claire? Do we have any questions too?
Oops, yeah, we have a question. First of all, before I do that, for those of you that happen to be on my email list, I've just offered a book on 2 practices of mindfulness, and I'm going to add to it. So, Claire, that's it. I don't know what they'll think to mindful masturbation, but I'm definitely going to explore that with you a little bit more. Yes, we have a message. So this is, hi Claire, why is there Viagra for men and nothing for women? And is it that the research has not been done, or is it that it's more complex because we're women?
I think there's probably a combination of both those things. So in essence, what Viagra does is it makes the penis swell with blood, or actually in the other way, it helps the penis swell with blood and then stops it from backflowing. So Viagra is a very physical thing. And what happens and this is where we know from the science that sexuality in a male body and sexuality in a female body are quite different. So for a significant proportion of men, if they have an erection, their mind will be online in congruence, which means that what's going on in their head is the same as what's going on in their pants. So for men, when they use Viagra, if they can get an erection, it will bring their mind online and the two things will be working together. What we know about female sexuality is slightly different to that, is things can be going on in your pants and nothing in your head, and things can be going on in your head and nothing in your pants. And so that's called incongruence. So the two things, what's going on in your head and what's going on in your body, are separated from each other. And we know that that's far more common in women. You may remember a number of years ago, there was an experiment that was about bonobo monkeys. It was about women watching bonobo monkeys and getting turned on by watching monkeys. Now, that wasn't about them becoming aroused in their mind. It's that what they noticed was when women were watching bonobo monkeys having sex on a screen, their genitals would respond. So your genitals can respond without you having any subjective awareness of being aroused. For men, it's quite different. So once they've got the Viagra on board and they get an erection, everything will come online. It's more difficult in women to do that. So that's why Viagra doesn't work for us, because swelling things down there doesn't necessarily make us feel sexual in some way. So that's the easy answer as to why Viagra works for men and there isn't something for women. But I think there is also something in the part of, we know less about women's sexual responses in general than we do know about male sexual responses. And there is also something there about the research issues and matters, and we're just a wee bit more difficult and a wee bit more complex, I would say, in general.
Yeah, absolutely. One other question I have is, so you mentioned about use it or lose it, and vaginal atrophy. Are you suggesting that if we use it, it will stop vaginal atrophy happening?
Well, I think there is probably a balance there. I think, is it going to stop it altogether? Possibly not, because some of it is hormonally driven. if we are using our genitalia regularly, be that with a partner or with a self-pleasure practice, with any array or myriad of toys that you want to use to get there, is it likely that it will perhaps be less obvious to you, or that the machinery will stay in better working order? Then yes, I think it probably is. So there is a balance to be struck. The hormonal things are real and it's really happening. I don't want women to go away with this idea, well, if only I did this, I wouldn't have vaginal atrophy or some of these symptoms. I think that's not true, but I think there is a balance to be struck, because what we do know is, particularly if women get to fairly significant vaginal atrophy, the vaginal vault, so that's the space, if you like, within the vagina, can contract quite significantly, and women may find themselves in a position where they can't be penetrated at all because of all of the tissues have involuted it, and it starts to kind of stick together, and it can be very, very difficult to penetrate. So there is something about using it to a degree that's comfortable for you, not to be doing something to yourself that, not to be tolerating your own touch, because we've all been there also where we're tolerating the touch of another. So not to be in tolerance in terms of doing things that you don't want to be doing, but certainly just being aware that bringing attention to your sexuality and using it will help. But is it going to stop vaginal atrophy altogether? No, I don't think so.
Okay, that's great. I think there is somebody who would like to ask you a question. Christine, I think. Would you like to unmute yourself? You have to unmute yourself, Christine. That's it.
Yeah. Sorry. I think Claire's probably spoken to it. It was actually just about the benefits of self-pleasure. So Claire has spoken about that, which I have found to be, I actually did the Orgasmic Yoga challenge, shall we say, and it had great results. What I was going to ask was, as far as toys go, is there anything? I don't have any, right? And I know there are things that are like sonic, and I don't even really understand what they do. So I didn't know if Claire could maybe speak a bit about that, about toys in the bedroom or anywhere else.
Thank you, Christine. I mean, I think, again, there are women of a certain age, the thought that they would go to an Ann Summers shop or even order something online and have it delivered anonymously kind of blows their mind. I think toys are a really helpful way for us to begin to really understand what it is that we like. Because sometimes women get to our age and haven't ever really figured out what it is that they like, or have never had the opportunity to explore it. So I think toys are a really helpful way to do that. I think sometimes women might be put off by seeing giant, enormous dildos to be penetrated with and all of those kind of things. And I would suggest that if people are starting with toys, is that you start with smaller vibratory type toys. So we also know that the vibrations, the sensitivity of our genitals in general begins to deteriorate with age. One, because of the hormonal drop-off that we have in that area, but also just because in general our nerves were less sensitive as we start to get older. So vibratory toys can be really helpful, particularly if you've never used them before. But the ones that you're talking about there, which are the sonic clitoral stimulators, they work in a slightly different way. So they're not vibrations. So if you imagine, they're not vibrations on the outside of the skin, they're using sound waves and sonic waves, and they're usually shaped with a little mouth. People describe it as feeling a bit like oral sex, as a kind of sucking feeling that goes with it. They are blooming marvellous, I have to say, from personal experience. I have found them to be a particularly unique addition to my own self-pleasure practice. But again, I think for me, sometimes it's just having the confidence to try. So we had somebody in the Facebook group that I run, we've had a lot of conversations about this, and women say, I don't even know if I could buy one. But then getting over that hump, if you pardon the pun, but getting over that hurdle and buying one and having an experience and going, wow, I didn't know this was possible. And now what's possible? And that's the important part for me, is that just try it. Just what's the worst that can happen? Just try it, and then we begin to realise that there's all these other things that are available to us if only we would allow ourselves. and the allowing ourselves is sometimes where we need to do on the unpacking and the unpicking. And, you know, the work that I do is beautiful, and I love it. And I love it when people have those wins and actually go ahead and try the thing. But we do sometimes need to do some foundational work about how do we feel about this? You know, what messages did we get about masturbation? What messages do we have about what kind of woman uses a sex toy? And so sometimes we have to unpick a lot of that first. But yeah, absolutely. Toys are a brilliant way to get to understand what it is that you enjoy and what you like.
Thank you.
And we have another question. I know Lizzie's got one as well. And we know that your website is the pleasure, Facebook site is the Pleasure Possibility. What's the name of your website? Do you have one? So
I'm also the Pleasure Possibility, but it's all down just now because it's all getting a revamp I'm very excited about. So the easiest way to get me is either to email me, which is info@thepleasurepossibility.com, or to look for the Pleasure Possibility Facebook group, which is a closed group. It's a private group, so you can come and only people who are within the group will be able to see what you post, which is often a big worry about people. Will my granny see this? I'm like, no. Which is a really beautiful, and there is something else about the opportunity for women to come together to have these discussions and not feel alone and not feel like they're on their own with this, because and there is something very special about our willingness to be open and vulnerable about our own experience, which is where this started for me, was about going, well, I can't be the only one having this experience. And sometimes it just takes a little bit of courage, and lurkers are also welcome. I know that there are people who come who simply lurk and may never get to that point of feeling comfortable, but they will still get something from being in a group and trying things out and having, and just the solidarity of other women knowing that they're not alone with it.
Yeah, that's really, really important, isn't it? To feel that you're not alone throughout all of this, particularly. And are there any particular websites about orgasmic yoga, or about how you can pleasure yourself, or, you know, are you encompassing all that in the website that you're developing?
All sorts of places you can get information. YouTube is great, do you know? Google it and just follow your nose and you'll find something that feels right for you. So there is a website that's called orgasmicyoga.com, which is run by Joseph Kramer, who invented orgasmic yoga. Some of it's perhaps a little bit 80s dated is all I would say. But yeah, there are websites out there. There are other people, sexological body workers like me out there offering things. I've got a in fact, Christine was made reference there to that. I've got a 7-day taster, which I provide for free for people, which is a 7-day taster, which explains what orgasmic yoga is and then gives you 7 days of practice to try. That kind of builds up slowly. We just start slowly, just start somewhere. You know, it's the whole put your body in the bed thing. Doesn't matter, just start somewhere. And see, and also an important part of it is the noticing and the being aware. What comes up for me when I do this? What comes up? Shame, guilt, all of the, just noticing, and then delving into those a little bit more and going, okay, well, what is that shame really about? Whose voice is that? Whose voice is it that's telling me that this is wrong or dirty or bad or whatever else? Where did that message come from? Is that still true for me now? If it's not still, if someone else told me that, that's how they felt, what would I say to them? And start to just exploring and unpacking some of our underlying scripts, oftentimes that are unconscious and they're not really our voice, and there were things that we've developed, heard, taken on from childhood and all those sort of things. So start to just unpicking some of that. It's not just all about, you know, the race to orgasm for me. That's not what this work is about. It's really about in a kind of holistic way, who do you want to be now? What kind of sexual being do you want to be? Because this is the perfect time for you to make some choices around that. Yeah,
that's those questions that you ask, you know, we can apply in so many different areas of life, can't we? Liz, I think you have a question.
I did, because I'd forgot this, brain fog hit me. When you were talking about incontinence, are there any exercises that women can do to help with their incontinence that will also help with their sex life? Or
absolutely. So the classic pelvic floor exercises are helpful. The incontinence piece that women experience can also be related to this estrogen depletion. So it's not just about pelvic floor weakness. It's also about the actual tissues of the bladder and the urethra. So that's the tube that collects the bladder to the outside, and the supporting structures round about that help all of that. So it's not just about pelvic floor weakness, but pelvic floor exercises will help. Arousal will help. So having that experience of arousal and using the machinery will also help. And vaginal estrogens can be extremely helpful in dealing with incontinence. And that's why, you know, sometimes women will come and say, well, I've got this often urgent incontinence, which is a thing where you put the key in the door and you desperately have to go, or something will trigger it and you have to go immediately. That's a really common sign in menopausal women in terms of that kind of genital urinary syndrome of menopause piece. That's quite a common one. And often they'll have that and maybe not have dryness and not understand that actually it's all estrogen. So pelvic floor exercises are good. And of course, pelvic floor exercises are great for your sex life. The stronger your pelvic floor is, the bigger your orgasms are going to be. So, you know, there are things that we can use that are useful in all sorts of ways.
And finally, what are your top 3 tips for improving your sex life in menopause?
Top 3 tips in menopause are: stop stressing about it. That's the first one, because physiologically within our bodies, we cannot do stress and arousal at the same time. So our stress system, our fight or flight system, if it is switched on, switches off our arousal system. So the other thing about women in midlife, and they become very hung up on it being very hormonal, is they're busy, they may have teenagers, they've got elderly parents, they're at busy times in their job. That actually, if you want to have a good sex life, you have to manage your stress, because your body cannot physically do them both at the same time. So managing stress would be the first one. The second one is easy. It's lube, because you can't actually have too much lube. So and getting over your aversion or your worry about lubrication and just buying some and seeing what happens. And the third one would be put your body in the bed. Put your body in the bed, put your body in the bed. It will come. We have to get away from this idea that women think they are going to be so suddenly overcome with overwhelming desire. It's unlikely to happen. But making it a commitment to having a sexual life that is fulfilling for you in whatever way, shape, form, flavour that looks like, making a commitment to it, committing to it and turning up and doing it will generally have effects. And for some women, that's where we start. You just turn up every day, like the Orgasmic Yoga practice, you just turn up and do the thing. At some point, something will shift and something will change for you.
Brilliant. I really enjoyed that, Claire. Thank you so much. We will be putting this on YouTube, and our lovely Claire at Pausitivity will be sending out links, and we'll include all of Dr. Claire's information and contacts and everything she's mentioned with that. So I just want to say on behalf of everybody, thank you. It was really informative. I'm going to go look up Orgasmic Yoga because I need
and mindfulness masturbation.
And masturbation,
exactly.
I'm going to get them. And just on behalf of everybody, I just want to say thank you. We're already starting to get loads and loads of thank yous in the chat as well. It was really interesting. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you.
And that's it. We'll be back in a month's time when we are doing, Claire?
Oh, we're doing menopause in the workplace.
Oh.
So we hear so much information, don't we, about, or we see it, Liz and I see it, and probably Claire as well, see on LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook, all this information about training the managers, about raising menopause or putting supportive things in place to help women in the workplace, and we're all for that. It's so very important. But there are also, not every workplace does that, and that doesn't necessarily make it easier for the employee herself to be able to still ask the right questions to get the right support and help that she needs in the workplace. So we have the fantastic Tracy Tate from the Menopause Training Company, and she is going to be helping you put together a script that will help you make be able to communicate effectively with your line manager or whoever else in the workplace that you need to talk to get the very best help and support that you personally need. So it's going to be a great session for us.
Looking forward to it. And that's it. Thank you all very much. And we'll see you next month, I hope.